I thought I would start by landing us exactly where we are in time, and I'm going to read just the first paragraph of the book. In 1963, a 20-year-old American woman could not expect to run a marathon or play varsity sports in college. She could only dream of becoming a doctor, scientist, news reporter, lawyer, labor leader, factory foreman, college professor, or elected official. She couldn't get a prescription for birth control, have a legal abortion, come out as a lesbian, or prosecute her rapist. She almost certainly knew nothing about clitoral orgasm or women's history. She could not get a credit card, let alone a mortgage, without the imprimatur of her husband or father. By 1973, the doors to these options and opportunities had cracked open, and a woman turning 20 in 1973 faced a future of possibilities that no generation before had ever experienced. So I get why you chose this decade. Why, in terms of the structure of the book, why did you choose, I know you had done one oral history, but why did you choose that again?
I mean, to do an oral history?
Yeah, an oral history, yeah.
I fell in love with oral histories, with writing them. I think it's a great way to tell history because I'd made a documentary, and that is what that experience made me love the power of first-person voice.
Yeah.
And after having been a journalist for most of my career and always being the narrator to the story, I suddenly realized the power of taking yourself out of that story, which people often do with documentaries. And so I wrote my last book, Witness, as my first book. I'd written some articles that were oral histories to sort of try it out, and I just loved the whole process. I interviewed 100 people then. It was a book about the 60s, and there were chapters where it makes you feel like you're in the room. It's a more visceral, emotional experience, I think, for readers. It's also not as dense. It's more accessible, I think.
Yeah. No, I loved this. And it was so fun to hear from the women directly, both posthumously, and then you obviously interviewed whoever you could.
Yeah, yeah. No, and also this movement in particular, it was all about personal change. You know, the personal is political is one of the big slogans of the movement. So I definitely didn't need to be in the way of these women. And each one of them had such completely different stories. And so it just felt much more authentic to let them tell their stories.
Yeah, and then sort of to referentially bring in the press articles and the clippings and the statements from courtrooms to fill in the blanks instead of just quoting or referring people out. So it's really fun. I'm going to read one more paragraph from the introduction to set us up for the meat of the book. So you write, 50 years later, second wave feminism's reputation hasn't aged terribly well. Conventional wisdom boils the movement down to a glamorous Gloria Steinem, a bitchy Betty Friedan, and an amorphous mass of white, middle-class bra burners. For at least a generation, historians largely ignored the critical role of women of color in the movement and were slow to capture the contributions of lesbian, Native American, Chicana, and Asian feminists, inflicting wounds that have chafed for decades. And specifically, and you do an excellent job of capturing these voices, but the failure to see Black women as progenitors of contemporary feminism. So you start the book with Betty, and you, in some ways, end the book with Gloria. They're two of the most visible feminists of that time period, both writers. Mm-hmm. So I understand the affinity. But why do you think it was important to start where you did?
Well, as much as Betty Friedan is now very controversial, the fact is she wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique, that came out in 1963, sold 3 million copies, and really lit the flame that then brought on this movement. And she had gone to Smith, and it was her 15th reunion. She was class of 42. And so she was part of a cohort of post-war women who rushed out of urban areas and moved to the suburbs. There was so much new money, and Madison Avenue was focused on getting women to buy as much as they could. And GM had moved from making bombs to washing machines, and there was a new cult of the domestic goddess. And Betty went around, and the other statistics that she learned is in the 50s, 60% of women dropped out of college to get married. And the average age of getting married then was 20. And birth rates skyrocketed. So women basically were backsliding from any advances they had made before the war. And so she documented this and interviewed many of her white middle class classmates, and they were miserable, many of them. And she called it the problem that has no name. And she just, when the book came out, it really struck a chord with so many white middle class women all over the country, and it really got things rolling. It was, of course, criticized, and I interviewed a lot of women who didn't relate to it because they were Black or they were working class, and their mothers had always worked, and they'd work the double day, as they called it. And so Betty, of course, it comes out 63, the height of the civil rights movement, and she's oblivious to class and race issues in the book. And so that has sort of made her legacy a little tainted. But she also, in context, she was writing about her people, and it had a big impact.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to watch her pop in various moments throughout the book, because to give her credit, 3 million copies, as we know, as people who write books.
You've sold at least that.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. As a writer, you're lucky to sell 3,000 copies. So to sell 3 million copies at a time when we weren't also swimming in other media is just stunning.
Yeah.
And she was clearly, as we learn in the pages of your book, an incredible marketer. So she, throughout sort of Now's existence, knew how to ignite moments.
Absolutely. Yeah. She was quite brilliant.
Yeah.
And she was a really good writer. She was a writer and speaker, and she could really get a crowd going, and she was a very good organizer.
Yeah, and she was relatively famous, or quite famous.
She was
really.
the first famous
feminist. First famous feminist. So just worth stating. I understand the complexity, and then also it takes all kinds. But as you mentioned, historians have framed it as really sort of the Betty layup, right? The period of Betty, and these historians have typically been white men, right? So let's start with one of the personal stories in the book, which is Newsweek.
Okay.
Yeah.
So actually, we're going to lead up to that just a little bit.
All right.
One of the things that Betty and her cohort and her group of emerging feminists were fighting was job discrimination, which was very extreme. Basically, women had won the vote in 1920, and then they went to sleep. They were exhausted. It took 80 years to get there. No other laws had happened that had helped with women's liberation in any way since 1920 until 1964, when the great Civil Rights Act was passed, which ended Jim Crow. And but Title VII, which was the section of that bill that was about employment discrimination, was written originally that you could not discriminate against anyone in the case of race or creed or nationality. But sex and gender was never mentioned until last minute, just before it was up for a vote. A segregationist Southerner named Howard Smith from Virginia added the word sex to that list, and it blew it up. Everyone started laughing, and that day of debate was called Ladies' Day, and of course he didn't want the Civil Rights Act to pass. So he thought this would scuttle the bill, and it did pass, and he didn't vote for the bill in the end. But it also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which started in '65, and they expected that only to be complaints about race discrimination, which was extreme in all different sectors of the employment. A third of the complaints came from women. So at that time, women couldn't be bartenders in Michigan or California unless your father or your husband owned the bar. They couldn't lift more than 30 pounds in most factories. They weren't forced to serve on juries, and in some states weren't allowed to serve on juries. The classified ads had help wanted. They were segregated: help wanted men, help wanted women, and the jobs available to women were mostly clerks, typists, nurse, teacher, and everyone was expected, of course, to leave their jobs in these white-collar jobs, at least, when they got married. So fast forward to the mid-'60s, when all of the Seven Sister brilliant women like Nora Ephron, who'd gone to Wellesley, and Lynn Povich, who had gone to Smith, they get the hot job in New York, which was working at Newsweek, which was a liberal news magazine, unlike Time, where the women had to wear white gloves and skirts, and it was very prim and proper. So Newsweek was cooler, and they were very pro-civil rights, and women could only have a few jobs, though. They could be mail girls, they could be researchers, and they could be secretaries. But all the other jobs, starting with writer and editor, were for men. In fact, Nora Ephron went and applied in, I think, 1965, when she was editor of her paper at Wellesley, and the guy interviewing her said, "What do you want to do here?" And she said, "Well, I want to be a writer." And he laughed at her and said, "Well, women don't write here. They can't write here." So that was just the rule. And eventually, these women, as the women's movement started to pick up steam, by the late '60s, they started realizing maybe this is actually illegal. And they were really frustrated. And a few of them went to the ACLU and met with Eleanor Holmes Norton, who had just graduated from, not just, but earlier had graduated from Yale Law School and had spent the summer of '64 Mississippi working for SNCC as a lawyer, where she had helped get Fannie Lou Hamer out of jail after she had been badly beaten, and she had been on the front lines of the civil rights movement and was a civil rights lawyer. And they showed Eleanor the masthead of Newsweek, and the first names were all men, and then there was practically a line, and all the rest of the names were all women. And so Eleanor was just thrilled, because it was such a cut and dry civil rights case. But she had to explain to a lot of these white privileged women that you have been discriminated against, and this is illegal. There's something called Title VII, and it's not allowed. And so because she had her experience as a civil rights lawyer, she understood, and an activist, what discrimination really was. Whereas so many privileged white women never thought they had really been discriminated against. So they were just kind of waking up to this. And that's to the point of so many black women, like Eleanor Holmes Norton, really were the leaders of this movement. And partly because they had started organizing and becoming activists in the civil rights movement. So they were way ahead of a lot of the white women in that case. So these women had to secretly meet in bathrooms and gather a class. Eleanor said, we have to have as many women as possible who will join. And eventually 46 of them did. It was very risky for them. They were afraid they'd get fired. They were friends with everyone they worked with. They felt badly. But they figured out the best day to announce this class action lawsuit, which was the first class action for sex discrimination in a white-collar working environment company. And so it was a really big deal. And Eleanor was starting from scratch. I mean, she was making arguments that no one had made before legally. But Newsweek had, by 1970, figured out that the women's movement was actually kind of a big deal. So they thought, let's do a cover story on the women's liberation movement. But lo and behold, there were no women writers on staff. And so they had to hire someone from outside to write it. And on the day that article, that magazine dropped, Eleanor and the 46 women had their press conference announcing the lawsuit. And it blew everyone away. They had to sue Kay Graham, who owned the company, was a woman, but was not hip to feminism yet. Took her a while. She caught on eventually, but it also changed the workplace ultimately for many, many, many women in many different sectors. And it took a few years to settle it, but it made a huge difference. They were forced to hire women as writers immediately and train them, and then fast forward to my experience. I graduated from college in 1985. And by 1989, I'd managed to get myself a job at Newsweek in the Washington bureau. And I was a reporter. I eventually got to be a White House reporter. And I would file stories every week up to New York to a woman named Lucy Howard, who was the editor of the front of the book. And I had absolutely no idea that Lucy Howard was one of the main plaintiffs in this lawsuit. And in fact, the whole time that I was at Newsweek for 5 years, I had no idea that these women, not really less than 20 years before me, had opened the door and rolled out the red carpet for me and my whole generation. And not until I started researching this book did I learn about this case. So it only made me feel better about doing the book, because I was supposed to know about these things and I didn't. Yeah. And I figured if I didn't, a lot of people probably didn't either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for pointing that out, because as I read this book, I read a lot, and still I felt largely ignorant about this period in time, and there were a lot of names I did not know, many that I did, but even those were presented to me in really fresh and interesting ways, partly because they're contextualized only by the period and the story and not by other people. And one of the things that it's also very striking to read is that it feels in some ways like you could be reading about 2020 or 2021 in terms of some of the infighting, or what Florence Kennedy called horizontal hostility, which, for people who don't know that term, she says horizontal hostility, I mean, it could be among siblings, et cetera, but it is misdirected anger that rightly should be focused on the external causes of oppression. But instead, whether it was at Betty or eventually Gloria, et cetera, there was just a lot of misdirected anger. Yeah, the Kate Millett story. Can you tell that story? Because that was stunning and devastating.
Yeah, really upsetting. Kate Millett was a radical feminist, and she was also an academic and brilliant, and was getting her PhD at Columbia in English literature, and wrote as her thesis this incredible takedown on the canon of American white male fiction writers. Updike, Cheever, Mailer, etc. And she analyzed their work and exposed how almost every single one of them was extremely sexist. And she published this book in 1970, and it was a huge big deal. And she was on the cover of Time magazine. Alice Neal painted her portrait, and she was the first feminist to be on the cover of a magazine. And that was the kiss of death for her, because her consciousness-raising group, who she had been talking to about her book forever, didn't want her to put her name on it, because they didn't believe in hierarchy, which was just part of the lefty radical ecosystem at that time. And it was sort of Maoist, that no one, it was a little bit anti-intellectual, and also very strictly anti-hierarchical, because that's the way men acted. So they thought she shouldn't put her name on it, which of course she did. And the radical lesbian group had decided that she needed to be outed because she was bisexual. And they thought that was a way to punish her for becoming famous. And so at a speech she was giving at Columbia, one of her comrades stood up and exclaimed, I know that, are you bisexual? Are you a lesbian? And she admitted, and she said yes. And that was the end of her career. Mm-hmm. She lost her teaching job. The book, which was selling really well, stopped selling. Mm-hmm. She had a nervous breakdown and moved to upstate New York and had a Christmas tree farm that she lived on for the next several decades. And so she was kind of destroyed by her own people.
Yeah. And was that officially Rita Mae Brown? She denies it?
Rita Mae Brown does not. Rita Mae Brown, I don't know if anyone knows who she is, but she's now a best-selling author, ironically. And she writes mysteries about cats mostly, and they all sell very well. But she was very much against Kate Millett putting her name on the book. And she was a very out lesbian so she also didn't like it when people were closeted. That was part of her mission. But it was said that she was the person who spearheaded that.
Yeah. And I mean, we reckon this is still a pattern in our culture today, specifically for women. It's very hard we were talking about this backstage, you rarely see a man being forced to take accountability even for egregious bad action. P. Diddy's streams are up 20%. And yet for women, it endures the ability to sort of knock that tall poppy down in the poppy field through reputational harm. And I know that we're somewhat aware of it. We're somewhat conscious of it in our culture, but yet we just watch and sometimes celebrate as other women are, quote unquote, put in their place. And I really wish we could stop that. It's really sad.
Yeah. No, a lot of I ended the book in 1973, and before the movement just started to eat itself alive, and there was a lot of infighting among all the different factions. It was really, really tough.
I was thinking about this quote from John A. Powell, I think he runs like the Institute for Othering, and it's such an amazing quote. But essentially, I'm going to paraphrase it, but that he wishes that we could learn how to be soft on people and hard and critical on structures, and that too often the opposite is how we function in the world, where we are so very hard on people and far too soft on structures. And that's a great quote. Oh, man. I mean, the complexity will never escape. We were talking earlier, we'll never escape sort of the complexity of these issues when you start stacking class, race, gender, and then determining who gets priority amongst those. And this is really sort of, that's like the meta thesis of this book, is watching different people try and steer the movement for pragmatism or efficiency, or, you watch people like Betty essentially sidestep. She was quite homophobic, no? Yeah, for example, in this effort to try and advance and make some movement in other areas, but it is not pleasant, which one of the ways that I love the structure of the book, which is it's not, a chapter in politics, a chapter in sports, it's all sort of concurrent happening all the time, but it gives the reader a bit of a break from the sausage making. And you tell some of the stories of women who singularly, or sometimes collectively, but through, for example, athletic achievement, changed the consciousness of the country just by doing something that women weren't supposed to be able to do. So can you tell the story of Bobby Gibbs?
Bobby Gibb. She is this amazing woman who I interviewed back in 2019, before COVID. And she lives in Gloucester, Mass.
Of course.
And she's now a sculptor. And she was just a natural born runner. She loved running. She would run with her dogs in the hills. She lived outside of Boston. And her father took her to watch the Boston Marathon, which at the time in the 60s was the only marathon in America. And she saw these men running and realized she just had to do that. And but doctors were telling women at the time that if you ran long distances, your uterus could fall out. It was dangerous. And
I tell myself
Bobby,
that. So
Bobby
that's my
knew
reason
that.
for not running.
Yeah, exactly. Watch out, Elise. But you are a champion skier, so, nice try. So she realized that was bullshit. And because she had already been running long distances on her own in secret. And so she tried to get into the Olympics, into the marathon using her name. They rejected her because she was a woman. So she just hid in a bush at near the starting line. She had a hoodie on. And she had trained in nurse shoes, which were the only kinds of shoes that she felt were comfortable because they were wide enough and enough cushion. And she jumped out of the bushes at the starting line and started running. And halfway through, she got kind of hot. She took off her hoodie. People figured out she was a woman. Luckily, no one was hostile to her on the trail, but the word got out and was on the radio. And by the time she got to Wellesley, which is a sort of epic part of the marathon, about halfway through, the Wellesley students had heard that a woman was running in the marathon, and they went crazy. Mm. And they do a tunnel for the runners, and they were dancing and singing Ave Maria and screaming. And all of a sudden, Bobby realized that she wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing this for all of womankind, and that women were deemed weak and, feeble and stupid and incompetent. And she needed to prove that women were strong, and she did that. And it, became news all over the world that she had done this.
Such a beautiful story, too, because they tried to remove her, right? And the men surrounding her.
No, that was actually the next year with Switzer.
Okay. But didn't the men, they realized
the men protected
her and sort of
her.
Created a little bit of a cocoon for her when they realized that they were running with a woman. I love that story. I'm going to read a bit from her. She tells you, it was like a pivotal moment where people saw things in a different way. And to me, that is the key thing. And that's what I've been trying to do my whole life, is change people's consciousness. Once the consciousness is changed in one person, then 2 people, then 10 people, then 1 million people, it becomes a social movement. And then you can get the laws changed, and then you can get the social system changed, and so forth. But it has to start with that change of consciousness. So I love that story. I thought, I somewhat knew the Billie Jean King story, but that was also really fun to read, particularly in this context. And there aren't that many opportunities, right, for sort of one person to, I know we like to tell history that way, right? That it's just one person who didn't get up off a bus, et cetera, when we think about history. But it is actually quite rare for someone to truly do something first.
Yeah, but her description of changing the consciousness is basically what happened one by one all the way through with thousands of women. And they were changing consciousness in terms of health, in terms of art, in terms of politics, law, and every part of society. They were becoming who they needed to be. And the strictures of the 50s had limited them. As Bobby said, we were just supposed to live in a box.
Yeah.
And she had to break out of that box. And so the box had been laid out for women. And this was a moment where, really for the first time in human history, women demanded to be first-class citizens and essentially Of course, we're not there yet completely, certainly not now, but managed to achieve that for the first time ever. And that's the other reason why I feel that it's so important to go back and learn about what happened then, because it was absolutely monumental. The change in consciousness, the change in women basically being raised in the 50s to think they could only do, a limited amount of things, to suddenly having the world open to them.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, when you think about some of the most impactful pieces of legislation for women in the context of sports, it's Title IX too, right? Which nobody realized they were doing.
Yeah, the sports part was sort of it was slipped in secretly.
Yeah, and nobody really understood even at that time the implications of that, right?
Yeah.
That all these public institutions would need to make is it equal investment in women's sports?
I think so.
Yeah. So, and you can't imagine people actually, well, I guess they're legally pressured to move on it, but this idea that actually women are stellar athletes too.
Yeah.
And
now $200 million is spent a year on athletic scholarships. So, I mean, the athletic part for Title IX is really important because it allowed women who are athletes to get educations.
Yeah.
I mean, I interviewed Donna Di Verona, who was a gold medalist in the Olympics swimming, and in 60 and 64. But when she went to college, she had to do side jobs to, pay for her tuition and her living expenses, where the guys on the swim team, there was no female swim team, of course, had scholarships.
Yeah.
Billie Jean King had to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Side jobs. And so, women just didn't have, colleges did not have many teams at all. They were mostly just intramural, and women played half-court basketball, so they didn't have to run the whole way. And they're basically, women's sports barely existed. And now look at, women were the majority at the Olympics.
Yeah.
For the first time this summer.
I want to make sure that we get to the second personal story in the book. She really doesn't write herself into her books the way that I seem to.
I know, you're much braver than I am.
You're wise. So you obviously write about the beginnings of Ms. Magazine, another sort of stratospherically successful, what was that, 3 million, millions of copies in circulation.
Yeah, and everyone thought it was just going to be a complete dud, and they were terrified.
Yeah, and then they were also somewhat shamed for their success, right? They're picked on within the movement.
Well, yeah, they weren't radical enough.
Well,
they were a little too white.
Yeah. So one of the things that they did was this. Will you tell us a story about what you found?
So the first issue of Ms. Magazine was January of 1972. It was part of New York Magazine. Clay Felker, who was a pretty progressive editor at the time, gave them half of the magazine to just try it out, see if maybe someone might want to read this. And there, at the time, there were lots of underground women's newspapers. Most cities had a few. But there was nothing mainstream. It was mostly McCall's and Vogue, and it was all very frustrating for these writers like Gloria Steinem and Letty Pogreman and so many others who had been trying to write about things they cared about but couldn't get them into any of the other mainstream magazines. So they started Ms., and boldly, the first issue had a centerfold with the headline, "We have had abortions." And it was a petition, and 53 women had signed their names to admit that they had had abortions. So it was a year before Roe v. Wade had made abortion legal nationally. And I was particularly interested because I was writing about Billie Jean King at the time, along with Ms., and she had given her name to this list. In fact, her husband had.
Yeah.
And she didn't know, so it took her by surprise, and the press, eviscerated her for it. She was so famous. At this time, she was the #1 woman tennis player, and so she got a lot of press attention. And she was accused of having an abortion just so she could make more money. And also her parents were very Catholic, and they found out about it because the California papers had big stories about it. So it was a big deal for Billie Jean King. And I thought, well, I should see who else is on this list. And I'd heard that Barbara Tuchman was on, which I thought was I don't know why I thought that was funny, but anyway. So I got one night, late night, I was working in February, and I printed out the PDF of this and went down, it went alphabetically, and the fourth name was Joan Bingham, who's my mother. And she had died about a year and a half before I was writing this chapter, and had neglected to tell me that she had put her name on this iconic list, which is now taught in a lot of women's studies classes. And it was just, it really, brought, suddenly this story, which was really about that generation, suddenly became part of my life. And she'd actually told me that she'd had an abortion years before, and that she'd flown to London for it, which was something that privileged white women could do. And that was all. It was sort of a taboo subject, and she didn't want to talk about it. Of course, I was curious, but I didn't push her, and it was before I was writing this book. And then I start this book, and every woman I interviewed 120 women, and asked each one of them, did you have an abortion? And almost everyone had had multiple illegal abortions, and each story was more horrifying and hair-raising and scary than the next. And I realized here I am interviewing these perfect strangers and wanting to know all about this incredibly private experience, and I never even asked my mother.
Wow. It's really interesting how abortion is, one of the primary red threads of this book, and a unifying red thread in a similar way to how it is now amongst all these groups, more or less. I know some of them wanted to skirt it because it was potentially too scary to lead with it, but all of these women were.
Yeah, now voted on their second, now started, National Organization for Women started in 1966, and in 67 they had their big sort of conference and decided where they were going to stand on issues. And there was a big debate about what they should do about abortion, and the more conservative people, women, and especially the nuns. There were several founders of now who were nuns, and serious Catholics, really were against it, and also thought it would turn off more middle class suburban conservative women from joining. But they lost. Betty was very much she understood that abortion rights were absolutely integral for women's rights, that you could not have equality or liberty without having control over your body. And at the time, 1 million women a year were getting illegal abortions in America, and over 1,000 were dying every year. And big city hospitals like Cook County and Harlem had their own wards for botched abortions. And Cook County at one point was having 100 women a week were going through that. So it was a healthcare crisis, essentially, because there was a perfect storm of the sexual revolution. So people were having sex before marriage for the first time in large numbers, and birth control was really hard to come by. It wasn't legalized nationally until 1972, and it was only legalized nationally that's 72 for single people. So before 1972, if you wanted birth control in most states, you had to put a fake wedding ring on and go and pretend that you were married to your gynecologist. So it was just very hard to get birth control, and everyone got pregnant, and it was a shit show, basically. And so we, went through the book, the stories are kind of stunning. And I was writing one of the abortion chapters on June 22nd of 2022 when the Dobbs decision came down. And I started howling with anger. And I haven't really stopped howling since, because it was so obvious to me then how we were going to go straight back. And now we have 20 banned states that essentially are living under Jane Crow. It is the same thing. I mean, women do not have human rights in those states.
Yeah. Well, and I hope and pray that Republican legislatures have just really underestimated the impact of this as much as it seems like they have in terms of galvanizing women and men
voters
to show up. And the story of the Janes.
They were my favorites. It started with this woman, Heather Booth, who had worked for SNCC and worked for SDS. So she was the classic civil rights anti-war activist. She was at University of Chicago getting a graduate degree, and a friend of hers from the civil rights movement came to her and said, "My girlfriend's pregnant, we need a doctor, can you help us?" And she knew a civil rights doctor in Chicago who gave this woman a safe abortion, and all the word got out, just lit like wildfire, and suddenly her dorm room phone started ringing off the hook. And she said, "Don't ask for Heather, ask for Jane," because she needed cover. And she started fielding all these calls. They kept on coming, and so she recruited the women in her women's liberation group in Chicago. Had a really strong women's liberation community, and it became very big. And there were dozens of women who worked for this underground abortion network, essentially. And they found safe doctors. They put advertisements in all the underground papers that said, "Need an abortion? Call Jane," with the number. And they had people who had different jobs so that no one knew the whole story of what was happening. It was very secretive. And eventually they learned that the main doctor they were depending on was not an MD, and he had been trained by the mafia. So they thought, well, if he can do it, why can't we? And they started apprenticing, essentially, with him, and about 6 of them learned how to perform abortions. And by 1972, when they got busted, they had performed 11,000 safe abortions. Wow. Women were coming from all over the Midwest to see them. So they were incredibly heroic. And if Roe v. Wade hadn't passed, been come down by the Supreme Court, been decided by the Supreme Court a year later, they all would have gotten 10 years in jail.
And what was also beautiful and unsurprising about the story is that it was quite expensive until they started doing them, at which point they were essentially doing them for free if needed.
And needs-based, and of course, because the doctor was still charging a lot. I mean, some of these women were paying $700 for abortions, which in 1968, that's probably the equivalent of $5,000. And they were just being, taken to town, taken advantage of.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about Shirley. Let's talk about Chisholm, and particularly at this moment in time, and sort of what she did for all of us, and tell us a little bit about her campaign, because it was also fascinating, and to recognize the lack of support from Black men and from some women. Yeah.
The National Women's Political Caucus, which she helped found, didn't endorse her, nor did the Black Congressional Caucus, which she helped found. She was the most amazing, badass, audacious, brave, confident woman, and she was the first Black woman elected to Congress from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and against all odds. She spoke fluent Spanish and just raised no money, but went everywhere and got all of the women in Bed-Stuy to vote for her. And She turns up in Congress, which had 10 female members out of 535 and 11 black members out of 500. It's so horrifying to think of how few there were. So there she is, the first black woman ever to step foot on the floor of Congress, and January of '69. And she's treated so terribly by the mostly Southern white, congressmen. On the first day, she went to the members' dining hall, got her lunch, sits down at an empty table, and a congressman comes up to her and says, "Ma'am, that's the Georgia delegation table." And she said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I didn't know where the New York one was. Would you welcome to join me for lunch?" And he said, No, this is the Georgia delegation table. And she said, "Well, that's very nice. Thank you for having me. And would you like to join me for lunch?" She ate lunch alone. No one joined her at that table. And it got worse. There was a man who would spit in his handkerchief every time she passed him. She then bought her own handkerchief and then passed him, spat in hers the same time he spat in his. She just faced these horrific people down. And then she had the audacity to run just a few years later for president in 1972. And Bella Abzug, who was her companion and colleague in Congress, and who she'd started the National Women's Political Caucus with, was upset because Shirley didn't check with her. And the Congressional Black Caucus was upset because they thought a man should be the first black person to run for president. So she was really on her own, but she was really driven. And she realized that the 5 white men who were in the primaries were not representing so many of the students out there who were extremely alienated because of Vietnam and Nixon, and so many members of the black community couldn't relate at all to who was running. And she was a huge coalition builder. She was the first Rainbow Coalition, and she had staff members of all races. She was very, she was very advanced on LGBTQ issues, which no one was at that time. And she was pro-choice. She was one of the founders of NARAL. And so she was just amazing, and she spoke to college students all over the country.
Yeah.
And she turned on Barbara Lee, who was a college student at Mills. She was a welfare mother of 2 and head of the Black Student Union and a Black Panther, and she invited Shirley to come speak, and was really amazed by her. And Shirley Chisholm said, "Well, you need to register to vote." And Barbara Lee was like, "No, I wouldn't do that. I'm a radical. Why would I want to vote? There's no one to vote for." And so Shirley Chisholm recruited Barbara Lee, who ran her campaign in Oakland, and later became a 13-term congresswoman.
It's a great
from Oakland. So she basically inspired a whole generation of young people who felt completely disenfranchised.
Yeah, the Barbara Lee story is great, because essentially she's like, "I'm gonna flunk me out of this course. I'm not voting. I'm not engaging in politics. Screw these assholes." I think does she get an A? I think she gets an A.
I think she got an A.
I think
she was taking a political science class where the assignment was, you have to work on a presidential campaign.
Chisholm was like, "You are voting." So,
right.
And I don't know if you want to read this moving, because obviously Shirley knew she wasn't going to win.
Right.
But the point was to do it anyway. And
you can read it.
This is Shirley. "When I got to the convention hall, it was lit up by noise. That was a wonderful moment for me, to see the way all of the delegates received me at the convention, because I had felt that someday a black person or a female person should run for the presidency of the United States, and now I was a catalyst of change." Sorry.
Oh.
But it's amazing and prescient. And
Kamala Harris met Shirley once, apparently in Oakland, I think probably in '72 when she was campaigning. So let's hope that she's Shirley's dream come true.
Thank you for writing this book. I mean, I know it was twice its length, and I can only imagine what you had to cut.
It should have been 2 volumes.
It should have been 2 volumes. It probably could have been 3 or 4. But it's really fun, and I know you all have copies, but to get to know names that you might not have heard from before. So thank you, and I learned a lot.
And that's a lot coming from you.
I don't know.
I was curious how witness to the revolution, like how that, if there's overlap, I mean, it's obviously Vietnam's going on at the same time, and I was wondering what the kind of link between the war protest and the women's movement was.
Thank you, Chris, my cousin. Well, actually, when I wrote Witness, I had just one chapter on feminism, which was about the women who come out of the anti-war movement and were really sick of, as Robin Morgans said, rolling their joints and pouring their coffee. They had no leadership roles in any of the organizations and felt marginalized, and suddenly realized how hypocritical this was. So they started to cleave off and do their own thing. And after I finished writing that, I realized, well, this is actually the movement that made the most change for the most amount of people and the most lasting change. And this has got to be my next book. And then I told my editor that was what I wanted to do, but it was 2016, and she said, oh, we can't sell feminism, Who wants to ever buy a book on feminism? And then a year later, Me Too happened. So that suddenly there was a new interest in women and women's history. But there was a lot of overlap, and some of the women I interviewed for Witness, I either re-interviewed or used their stories in this book too, and it's just a more expanded version. And it was hard telling all those layers because all of them were involved in one or more of the movements for social change in the 60s. And I tried to, the ERA, first ERA hearing took place soon the weekend after Kent State, for example. So when things like that were very, obvious, I tried to make that point that this was also what was going on, and, the world was blowing up. And it's, it was hard to really show the real context, the full context, but I tried to do that as much as I could.
How did these women look back on what they'd done? I mean, was there a great deal of pride, pleasure, sorrow? The backlash happened pretty quickly. What was their take on what it had all been?
That's a great question, and they all were different, obviously, but I would say generally, I was catching them at a really good time, and that was the other reason why I felt so motivated to do this book. Everyone I interviewed were between the ages of 75 and 95, and so they were at stages in their life where they were reflecting on what they had done. Many of them were collecting their papers to give to archives, and so many of them were retired, so they had time, and having that sort of 50-year span, it's almost as if you need to retell history every 10 or 20 years because the context is so different, and so they were, I think, both really proud of how much they had changed. And as depressing as losing abortion rights is for us now, I found this book really inspirational because I realized how bad things were before. It was so much worse. And I think women now sort of think, oh my God, this is terrible. It's never been this bad before. And the fact is, it's been way worse. So they knew that, and they knew how much they had done to get us to where we are now. And I think they were really proud of it, but also a lot of them had been beaten up by the backlash, which started with Phyllis Schlafly in about 1971 as she latched on to understanding that the ERA was a really good political vehicle for her, and brilliantly defeated the ERA by 1982, and it was devastating. I mean, the entire movement focused just on getting the ERA ratified in 2/3 of the states for 10 years.
Yeah.
And they failed. And it was terrible. The other thing that failed, that was the beginning of the backlash, which you write about in your book, is there was a enormous comprehensive child care bill that Shirley Chisholm and Bella Abzug and a bunch of other people on the Hill, Martha Griffiths, managed to get passed in the House and the Senate. It got to Nixon's desk, and he vetoed it. And that's the last comprehensive child care bill that has ever made it to a president's desk. So there were, those two stunning defeats were something that still stings with all of them. And I think they were curious about how to move forward. And I, of course, see what they did as a blueprint. They were incredible organizers, and they were dogged, and they sacrificed a lot. And so that's what we're going to have to do.
Yeah.
So since you're in Los Angeles now, I wonder if you have any opinion on any of the efforts to turn the subject of your book into cinema or television shows, television series that have sort of appeared.
Are you a producer?
Yeah, would you like to
Are you
option
inquiring about the rights to her book?
Call my agent, Steve. No. I mean, I fantasize about it being a scripted series. I think it would be great.
Ooh.
I think that's the best way to transform it visually. I think there's been a really good documentary that came out a while ago called She's Beautiful When She's Angry, and it caught all these people at least 10 or 15 years ago, and it was a better time to interview them. And so I think a documentary could be fantastic, but would be mostly archival and really hard, and would have to take a lot of episodes. And so I'm hoping there'll be some fabulous showrunner out there who will have great ideas for a scripted series.
So I once went to a one-woman show, Constitution was to me, and she had a one-liner that said, 2 if not 3 justices had mistresses, and this is why Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court came down the way it did. Have you ever heard that?
No, I hadn't, and I wanted to see that show when I didn't get to see it. No, I hadn't heard that. So they were afraid their mistresses might get pregnant.
It's a one line in the show. I just wondered if it came up in any of your research.
I wouldn't say I'm a really deep expert on who the exact justices were and what their biographies were, so I don't know. But I hadn't heard that or read that anywhere in all of my research. That's pretty fascinating.
Where do you see yourself going next?
Oh, I wish I had a fake answer for that. But I don't. I have some ideas that I have to really fall in love. So it's hard for me to be as professional as I would like to be. I swore when this book came out that I would already have a contract for my next one, but I do not. And so, but I just want to keep on doing what I do. I really like it. I really love telling oral history.
Yeah. It's a great service to sort of put air back into all of these stories, and then they get picked up again. In closing, is there anyone, who is your favorite character?
That's not fair.
Okay, sorry.
It's sort of like asking who's your favorite child.
Do you have a favorite child?
So,
you can say that too.
But one of my favorites, of course, is Bobby Gibb.
Yeah.
I just love her. And the other one, actually, the person I came away worshiping at the highest level is Polly Murray.
Yes.
Who had died long time ago, so I didn't get to meet her. But she's really, I think, the hero of the book and the legal architect of the movement.
Yeah. It's
There's a great documentary about her, too.
I feel like in the last decade, Polly Murray is really getting...
She's kind of resurfaced from no one knowing anything about her.
Yeah. Dahlia Lithwick, have you read her book? It's about, what's it called? Lady Justice.
Yes.
Yes. If you want more Polly Murray, which you will after you read this book.
Right.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Clara.